the creation of the terra nullius or an empty land um, that could therefore be claimed and legally possessed by the colonizers without any consideration for any earlier claims by aborigines who lived there before. So, the literature of Australia after the colonization um, excludes the literature represented by the Aborigines, and that created a kind of void or emptiness. And the term terra nullius or an empty land defines this kind of the empty void that has been created in Australian literature after the colonizers came. This kind of representation of the civilization, culture, um, and mm, the contribution of the Aborigines as not existing was a colonial act that for a long time left the Aborigines outside or on the margins of discussion of Australia as a nation. So the colonizers consciously rejected the claim of Aborigines as citizens of true citizens of Australia, and that became a kind of the center margin context or center margin contrast that exists in Australian literature. Then this way of thinking about Aborigines is increasingly being challenged by and on the behalf of the Aboriginal people. The Aborigines are telling their own stories and histories of the Australian nation and making them available for everyone. They are also laying claims to the legal possession of the land. Later waves of immigrants from southern Europe and Asia, as well as other groups silenced by the powerful colonial version of Australian identity. History and literature are also producing histories and literatures. These versions question traditional presentations of the Australian nation as a nation created by white colonizers, mostly from within. All this is forcing people to take a new look at a part has traditionally been considered as um, Australian literature and make it include text and voices it had earlier ignored. So this new Australian literature wants to emphasize, gives focus on the Aboriginal literature or Aboriginal writing. The old Australian and the literature of the literature of Australia after colonization, they consciously ignored the original people of original Australians, which has been rejected by the Aboriginal people. They had to come up with their own literature, own writings, own folklore, all these things, and they have represented Australian literature in its original shape. Um, Within traditional white Australian literature itself, the idea of idea of what continued the Australasian of Australian literature was a point of debate. This became especially marked as the people of Australian settler colonies tried to define both for themselves and others the nature of their political, social, cultural, and literary relationship with the former colonial center retained. At least two positions become important in the early decades of the 20th century. Mm, One argued that truly great literature had to follow the rules and traditions of the literary models of British and European literature, as these were universal and eternal. The other position argued that the distinctive features of Australian literature should express the tendency to define Australia without using Britain as a reference point or model. So this is very important. How the English or European domination of Australia has sidelined the Australian literature and culture is being pointed out by the Australian literature, distinctive Australian literature, which tries to ignore the British and European claim over Australia's culture and literature. And Turner captures the sense of urgency at the point in history to define the Australian nation as a different from Britain through literature. When he quotes Nettle Palmer's from modern Australian literature, which was published in the year 1924, um, quote, Australia was no longer a group of more or less important colonies um, hanging loosely together on the ample mm, bosom of Britannia. Australia, with its henceforth what as the name was what the name was to mean. It lay in the hands of writers above all to discover. So, what is Australia to us is the person presented by the Europeans or British colonizers, but to the Aboriginal people. Australia is how they behave, how they live, how the culture represented by Aboriginal people have dominated Australia even before the colonizers came to Australia. And this is a kind of contrast, this is a kind of um, a position between the Aboriginal version of about Australian literature and the European and British version of Australian literature. And one has to find out a middle course between the two in order to in order to find out what is the essence of Australian literature and what is the Australian literature proper. And the essence of urgency was complicated by the problem of the social um, and the political differences, cultural differences, and the historical misrepresentation which Australian literature um, was supposed to present. If Australia and its literature were to be identified in terms of their differences with Britain and its literature, it was not very clear which areas of difference would be focused upon. uh, would it be the real and very obvious differences seen in the land or differences in the spirit of the people that were more difficult to define and describe? Either way, both sets of differences were constructed and depended on whatever aspect the writers consciously choose to focus on: the land, the people, and the spirit of contribution of these three. And Another aspect of this whole effort of creating a distinct national identity was the two-way full of wanting to cut loose from Britain while still desiring to retain its spirit, interest, and recognition. So, on the one hand, they use the English language to represent them, and on the other, they try to emphasize, focus on their culture and history, which was consciously been ignored by um, the Britishers. And similar was the case with India. When the colonizers were there, they wanted to give their version that India was not very cultured, and some they have come here to civilize us. And after some time, after independence, we came to realize that they don't have any role anymore in India, and we have to represent ourselves. We have to identify. We have to have separated identity, different from the British um, domination. So in this way, it took time to Indians to define their identity, a search for an identity was prominent immediately after the British vacated India. Similarly, in Australia too, we had similar kind of problems between the European and British representation and the Aboriginal representation. And when Aboriginal people want to say something, they were rejected by the British and European kind of presentation, where they wanted to say something of their own, consciously ignoring the claim of the Aboriginal people. So, in this way, we find a kind of contrast between the original British version and sorry, the original Aboriginal version and the makeshift British version, European version, where this kind of contrast, this kind of dichotomy between the two versions are very, very prominent when we go to read Australian literature. And the definition of Australian literature depends upon these two dichotomies. On the one hand, we have had the Aboriginal representation who wanted to focus on their roots, and on the other hand, the so-called cultured version of the European and British, European and British version of colonizer version uh, of Australian literature, which consciously ignores the Aboriginal claim of cultural superiority or their claim of identity. So, whenever we go to read Australian literature, we should have these things in mind: the representation of the Bush, the convict theory, the settlers, the immigrants. All these things come into mind when we want to read Australian literature or we want to see, formulate any kind of theory about Australian literature. So I think today we have to wind up this class, and maybe by the next time you all have to come and share your doubts and your clarifications from me. I can have clarifications of your doubts, and you should come and join in large numbers in order to make this class a kind of grand success. Thank you, one and all, and see you in the next class. Thank you.